All right. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here with all of you. I've really enjoyed this event and spending time with you. So it's come up in discussion already this week a couple of times, this idea that one of the most consequential and important forces shaping the future of life on our planet is this rapid pace of technological change. Technology is moving at an incredible speed today. And so what I want to do in this session is really give us here kind of a structured way of thinking about this question of why is it that technology is accelerating and developing so quickly. And then more importantly, what I really want to do is ground this in the context of the social philosophy of Neohumanism. And really my core argument, what I really want to stress is that I think all of you in this room are probably participating in one of the most urgent and important work, the most important work on our planet, because given what we're seeing with this pace of change of technology, the imperative and the need to kind of raise the moral development of our species on our, for the future of life on our planet. And that is really going to be a critical part of the role of educators. And I want to give a sense of what technology's role in that future is. Okay, now it was mentioned in the introduction. I thought I would just give a little bit of context of my professional life that sort of informs the way that I think about technology. So for the last almost 15 years now, I've been working at an organization called Singularity University. So we were founded in 2008. It was a collaboration between many large organizations. So this included some corporate companies like Google, Genentech, Autodesk. We were actually based at NASA Research Park, which is one of the major NASA facilities in Silicon Valley outside of San Francisco. And really the core sort of imperative for why this organization was created was to really try and understand why this pace of technological change is sweeping across our planet. But in particular, we were started as a nonprofit really oriented around these big global challenges. And for many years, our curriculum was rooted in, I know many of you are familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the idea behind the organization is to try and empower leaders of companies to think in a new way, but especially entrepreneurs, young people who can see technologies as a tool to potentially address and try to solve some of these big challenges that we're faced with. So for most of my career, I've worked in executive education, and as was mentioned, I've written about a lot of the technologies that we're going to talk about. So just a little bit of context about sort of my perspective that I hope to bring here. Where I want to start, and I'll give a sense of the scope of what we'll cover in a moment, but I want to begin by going back to the spring of 1997. And so just for context, this was at a time where most computer scientists were fairly convinced that we were probably decades, if not longer, away from being able to build a computer that could compete with a human in a game like chess. Now, many of you might remember in 1997, this was a huge breakthrough. A company, IBM, built a computer called Deep Blue, and it earned worldwide headlines. It was a huge deal, and the reason is not only was this computer able to beat a human in the game of chess, it was able to be a world grandmaster. This is, Russian chess master Garry Kasparov. Looks very flustered. It looks super unfun to lose to a computer in chess. But the reason I bring this up is I want to sort of call out a news article that came out in 1997 in the sort of aftermath of this big global development. So essentially what this New York Times article said was, okay, yes, this was a big deal. It's impressive that we now have computers that can mimic human intelligence by playing chess. But actually, if we really want to test our capacity to mimic human intelligence, we actually want to look beyond the game of chess. And what became really exciting for computer scientists was a game called Go, which, if anyone has spent time in Asia, is a very popular game in Asia. Now, the reason Go was so interesting to computer scientists has to do with the complexity of the game. So the way that Deep Blue, this computer from IBM, played chess is essentially what it did is it imagined all the possible games of chess, and at every move, it just picked the move that had the highest probability of winning the game. But basically, it's able to imagine every possible game of chess. It's called brute force computing. It's kind of a very crude way of mimicking intelligence. Now Go, as a game, is played on a 19 by 19 grid. It's actually an insanely complex game. There are more outcomes in the game of Go. If you were to take the number of atoms in the universe and multiply that number by itself, you would still have more potential outcomes in the game of Go. So there's no computer that could possibly imagine all the potential outcomes. And so with that context, one of these journalists, they asked this leading computer scientist at the time to make a prediction. When will we have computers that can play the game of Go? And their answer was, it may be 100 years. It'll be 100 years before computers beat humans at Go, maybe even longer. There was actually some debate if this was even going to be possible at all. Now, it wasn't 100 years. In fact, it was 20 years later. This is almost a decade ago now. A company from London, that's called DeepMind, it's a Google company, built an algorithm that is now one of the world's leading Go players. Now, this afternoon, I'll do a workshop that kind of explores the basics of how this kind of intelligence, this AI system, it's basically no longer are we giving computers the rules that it follows. Now we're essentially using what's called machine learning. It's a way of letting computers teach themselves. But the point is, the reason I use this example is many of the developments and the breakthroughs that we expect to come from technology very often happen far sooner than we expect, far faster. Things are moving far faster than we realize. Now this is an older story, just like maybe a more modern. There are many modern equivalents of this, and probably one of the most exciting examples of this is the deployment of solar technology, right? Governments around the world, they need to know how much solar installation can we expect over the next, however long, right? CEOs of companies constantly need to know to build a strategy, how much renewable energy we can expect. To answer those kinds of questions, there are many of these very prestigious forecasting organizations. Probably the most famous is one based in Paris. It's called the IEA. Now the IEA, every single year, puts out a forecast where they predict how much solar we expect to be installed. And what I'll show you, as what you'll see on this graphic, those black dots reflect the actual solar installation. And what those yellow lines indicate is that every year what the IEA does, essentially it seems like being a forecaster, you grab a marker and you just draw a straight line. You just predict this incremental growth. Now I have seen some forecasting models, these are like 25-year time horizons. The amount of solar they expected in 25 years, that number was surpassed 16 times over in the first 3 years, right? And these are the global leaders in forecasting. That wasn't the IEA, that was one in the US. The point is, the reason I use these examples is that, and this is kind of the core of this entire presentation, is that our ability to process, make sense of, forecast exponential growth is very limited. This is a quote from one of our founders at Singularity. It says, "Our intuition about the future is linear, not exponential. It makes a huge difference." Our sense-making systems are really just very challenged at this ability to process exponential growth. And so with this presentation, this is kind of the journey that we'll go through. I want to really spend some time explaining what do I mean when I say exponential growth? Like, what are we talking about? I really break it down, how this relates to technology. Then, at Singularity, we use a model. It's called the 6Ds model. I'll explain, I'll kind of go through it. But it's a way of organizing our thinking of the kinds of phenomena that we expect to see as technologies become subject to these exponential curves. And where I'm really excited to kind of, the point of introducing these is to really get into the implications. And I have 3 very specific points I want to make about what this has to do with within the context of Neohumanism. I'll signal, I will pause about halfway through and I'll just check in if there are any questions, discussion, and then at the end I'll open it up and we can have more of a broader discussion. So that's kind of the scope of what I want to do here. Okay. So let's get into this first concept. Okay, so I keep using this term exponential. It's in the title of my presentation. What am I talking about? Like, what is this word even referring to? So on the surface, exponential growth curves, this is a fairly straightforward concept. It's kind of like basic algebra. It's some number that grows at a compound rate over time. Like, we learn how to do this in high school algebra. But really, the core idea behind this presentation is that we are actually very challenged. It's a very difficult thing for our intuitive systems to process exponential growth. And we have some very clear sort of recent examples of this historically, right? Like the coronavirus. The regular flu, by the way, grows at an exponential rate. It's just that the coronavirus, the rate of growth, right? We saw it took 3 months to reach 100,000 reported cases. And then after hitting that milestone, it took 12 days to hit the next 100,000 cases, right? This kind of growth is very hard to make sense of as human beings. Now, to make this point, I want to actually ask you to join me in just a quick thought experiment, to imagine something, just to kind of really make this point, which I'll use throughout the presentation. Okay. So imagine you're in your office, wherever kind of work you do, and I don't know if you have a manager or a customer or someone you can imagine comes into your office and asks you to make a choice between two options on behalf of the organization that you work for. If you're at a school, maybe it's the director, or maybe it's the superintendent. The two options. One option is a pile of money on a table. It's $1 million. You can actually see the money. It's here right now. You can have it. You can use it however you want to do. The second option, so the second choice, is a single penny. Except that this penny is going to double every day for 30 days. So on the first day, you're going to start with 2 pennies, then it becomes 4 pennies, and then it becomes 8 pennies. So at the end of 30 doublings, at the end of this month, which of these two options is the better choice? Yeah. And I see everyone excitedly, you know where this is going. And I imagine you probably saw where I was leading, I'm referencing exponential growth. And you're exactly right. The penny is the better choice. Now, there's a reason why I like to use this particular thought experiment, even though I know you saw where I was going with this, well in advance. Here's why I like this thought experiment, because this decision mimics very often, especially in the kinds of corporate environments that I spend time with my clients, this mimics the reality of an executive. Because let's say you very correctly understand the penny is the better choice. But your manager, they don't understand exponential growth. They don't have time. They see a pile of money. You said no to it. So very likely what's going to happen is they want status updates. They want progress reports. You have, many of you are probably used to having to go and report on, progress of your projects, right? So let's say your manager comes back halfway through the month. It's 15 days. Their expectation, they see a pile of money. It's $1 million. It's halfway through the month. They're thinking, okay, just to even be on pace to meet that first option, halfway through the month, we should be at least at $500,000 by now. That would make me feel comfortable, right? So the penny halfway through the month is at $163. This is usually, corporate audience. This is how managers feel. This is when projects get killed. This is when a company writes off a technology. This is when someone says, this was a failure. This didn't work. The point is, though, as we know, at least in this example, this is just a simple doubling pattern, an example of exponential growth. Every step in this progression is the equivalent of all the previous steps combined. So you actually do reach that $1 million threshold on the 27th day, so the 28th doubling. And on the 31st of the month, on the 30th doubling, you actually have 10 times what was in that first option. Now, here's what's really challenging about this progression, is that the vast majority of that has accumulated just in the final few steps, right? This is very counterintuitive to the human intuition, right? We are very good incremental thinkers. Now, why do I go through this? Why do I start with this thought experiment? The reason I go through this is what we're starting to learn, and this is kind of a recent insight only in the last few decades, is that the story of technology, innovation, engineering, very often, across human history, very often follows this kind of exponential trajectory, this kind of exponential growth. And you can see that expressed in so many different ways, right? Like how many domains in our world where we've seen more changes in the last 50 years than we've seen in the last 50,000 years. Like transportation is a good example. Or when I do interviews with technology experts, very often what I will hear them say is, I've seen more changes in the last, 3 months or 3 years than I've seen in my entire career. Like this is an expression of exponential growth. We see this all the time. And actually, I just put this in because when I was doing the research for this presentation, I came across this last week, so this is like 2 weeks ago. If anyone follows, in northern Chile, in the Atacama Desert, they've just opened in April this new, one of the most powerful telescopes. It's essentially the largest digital camera humanity has ever built. It's a 3,200 megapixel camera. But there was a sentence from this article that really grabbed me. It said, in its first year, it will double the amount of data collected so far by every other instrument in the history of optical astronomy, right? So this is from 1609, Galileo inventing the telescope. All the data we've collected until this point, in the next year, single year alone, this camera, this telescope, will create twice as much data. Will essentially create that same amount of data in the next year, right? So this is just one example. You'll see expressions of this in the news if you pay attention in technology all the time. Okay, so given that, there are really two important questions that we should be asking about this phenomena at this point. The first question is, well, why does technology grow at an exponential rate? Like, that's not an immediately obvious phenomenon or concept. Like, why wouldn't it grow incrementally? Like, why does it grow at an exponential rate? So to kind of address that first question, there's an essay that was written 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now, by Ray Kurzweil, one of the co-founders of Singularity. And the essay, it's a very good essay, highly recommend it. It's called The Law of Accelerating Returns. And I'll summarize very briefly the argument he makes, which essentially, what he's saying is that the way that systems that learn over time, that involve themselves, actually can use better versions of itself to continue its learning. He actually argues this is a very deep principle of how biology works. Like, you go from single cells, eventually it discovers how to evolve through multicellular organisms, and you speed up the rate of learning. In the context of technology, think of an example this way. In the 1960s, the way we designed computer chips is we had engineers physically, like literally draw line diagrams to sort of map out the computer architecture, the transistors. Now, of course, we use computer chips to help us design even better computer chips. And once we have those better computer chips, you can see how this process, amplifies and feeds back on itself, right? And you see this, again, all over the technology landscape. AI is probably one of the best expressions of this, right? This is an old headline, but you can imagine when Google is using AI software to build better versions of AI software, that should accelerate the ability to create AI software, right? Now, and this is essentially the same thing more recently, we're basically using AI now to do things like design computers and build better versions of AI and so forth. And we'll talk more about this afternoon if you're interested. There's a second phenomenon that's worth knowing, because there's another reason why technology grows at such a tremendous pace. And I'm actually going to pause and ask, is there anyone in the room who's ever heard of or come across the concept of something called Moore's Law? So Moore's Law, it's probably the most famous expression. I see some nodding heads. So for those that may not be familiar, Moore's Law is one of the most famous examples of exponential growth. It's basically the observation that our computers, for the same cost, get twice as powerful every 2 years or so. And it's the reason why computers that were once full buildings in size now fit in our pocket and are billions of times more powerful. It's now fairly well understood that Moore's Law is actually an expression of something deeper, something else, something called Wright's Law. So what is Wright's Law? Wright's Law is essentially the observation that the pace that an organization can learn to produce a product or service over time accelerates. And the reason it does that is basically what it says is once you have a sufficiently large marketplace, that market puts a demand pressure on a group of organizations to come and try and meet that demand. And so through competition and trying to find, to serve that market, it forces the organizations to find better, more efficient ways to produce that product or service. And when you find more efficient ways to produce that product or service, it lowers the cost. It becomes cheaper. And when something becomes cheaper, it increases the size of the market. And then when the market grows, it drives more demand for companies to try and meet, et cetera. You can see how this follows this self-amplifying feedback loop. Now, this is very much rooted in a system of market-driven capitalism, and there's longer conversations to be had. I know many of you will be attending the Prout conference next week. But this essentially explains, solar technology, why it's following these exponential curves. This is Moore's law. This is why televisions used to be thousands of dollars, today are hundreds of dollars. This is the core phenomenon. Now, this is kind of why, Moore's law is the most famous, but there are tons and tons, there are dozens of examples. It's the cost of DNA sequencing. It's the cost of lighting this room has fallen, at exponential rates. The cost of getting physical matter off Earth into space is also following these same kind of curves. And then the final example of this, I think it's just worth mentioning that this is very well sort of understood now that many times skill acquisition, like learning a new skill, right? So if you're learning to play guitar, it can take a long time to learn the motor skills of playing the scales, and it takes a while and it's tedious. But then once you have that skill, it becomes the foundation to accelerate the learning of even more advanced skills. And eventually, if any one of you are meditators and the yogis in the room, that sometimes it can feel like you make more progress in a few weeks than you've made in like years and years of practice, right? And it's because of this kind of deeper phenomenon of how progress compounds on itself. There's a second question then we should be asking. So that explains kind of why technology develops at this exponential rate. But there's a second thing that we should really sort of reflect on, which is, okay, then why now? Why is it now, all of a sudden, that technology seems to be hitting this vertical line of growth, and it's moving so quickly, and we're reverse engineering brains and looking at rocks on Mars and creating synthetic life in laboratories? And the answer that I would argue, and this is probably, I would say this is maybe the most important image that I will show you in this whole presentation. So if you take one thing, this is essentially, and I'll explain what we're looking at, but this basically explains everything we'll talk about is an expression of this. Okay, so what are we looking at? So this was a question that Ray Kurzweil in his academic work asked about the development of computing. And he asked a very specific and very kind of straightforward question, which was he wanted to know what the price performance of computing has developed, how that has developed over the last 100 years. Which is, to be clear, it's a slightly different thing than asking how powerful have computers become. It's basically saying, if I pay $1,000, how much computing power do I receive in return for that $1,000? And so what he's found is that, and keep in mind, a computer used to be a job for people. Like the term calculator was actually, it was first formed as a description for a job that people used to do. So when you paid $1,000, you're actually paying people. Now, of course, we use integrated circuits and computers. But over the last 125 years, the improvement of the price performance of computing has followed this exponential growth. There's one thing you should know about this chart, which make it pretty astonishing. So this chart is not a linear chart. It's what's called a logarithmic chart. Basically, that's a fancy way to say that the data on the y-axis has been compressed. Each step on the y-axis going up is actually 1,000 times. Is it 1,000? Yeah, no, 100. Sorry, it's a 100 times improvement. So to understand that in another way, basically, and someone at Singularity calculated, if you wanted to draw this data set, this chart, on a normal linear piece of paper, you would need a piece of paper about 60,000 times further away than the moon to draw this chart. Okay, I know that's a big number, it's hard to conceptualize. Let me make that more tangible. I'll give an example. So this is a computer that came out in 1997. It was called the ASCII Red. It was a big deal. I don't know why this one's not red. It cost $50 million. It was very expensive. And the reason this was a big breakthrough, it was the first computer that was capable of calculating 1 trillion calculations per second, what's known as a teraflop of computing. So this was very exciting. So at Singularity, we did research. When did we, as consumers in the room, have access to a teraflop of computing? And it turns out, in 2017, you could buy this computer chip. It retailed for around $2,000. It was part of the X series, the Intel chip family of chips. But this, of course, doesn't slow down. And I'll ask, is there anyone in the room, just curious, does anyone have an iPhone 16, like the news? Okay, so I see. So it looks like we have one in the room. We have a couple. Okay, we have a couple. You don't want to announce yourself as a super early tech adopter, but we're very happy to have you in the room. So for those that have an iPhone 16 Pro, This phone, this device, does about 37 trillion calculations per second. So just to put that into perspective, that would be like going back to 1997, which, by the way, that's not that long ago, right? I apologize for the very US examples, but this is when, this is when the first Harry Potter book is coming out. Michael Jordan is still, winning an NBA championship. Like, we can remember how long ago this was. Basically, bringing an iPhone 16 back to 1997 and talking to a computer scientist in this lab would be like saying, okay, I like this computer. I want you to make it 37 times more powerful. Then I want you to shrink it down to the size of a graham cracker so I can, forget it in an Uber, lose it somewhere. And I don't have $50 million. I'll give you a few $100s with the cell phone plan, right? Like, that's essentially the amount of progress we've seen in the price performance of computing. That's just the last 20 years, right? Like, that's not that long ago, 25 years. And so that is essentially the amount of change that goes back over the last 125 years. Now, why does this matter? This matters because what's happening in technology today, we're living through an era, and this is what I'll kind of foreshadow to the next section, where we're digitizing the world. Digital information is becoming the dominant sort of way that we inform our way of managing the world. And so as all of these technology domains essentially become the domain of computer science, they're becoming information systems, this chart is essentially like the engine driving forward all of these other domains. All of these other domains are now becoming subject to computation. And I'll unpack that a little more in the next section. But I'm about halfway through, so I want to pause. Just what we've covered so far, are there any questions, anything I can clarify, anything I can make more clear?
I wanted to ask a few questions because I think one of the pressing questions is our ability to adapt to climate change because our own hardware doesn't progress, not even linearly, I think.
Yeah.
It remains pretty much the same, and also the ability of the planet to adapt, because we have also, I think, the constant amount of resource on the planet. And so in many ways, like, this exponential acceleration of technology might feel like racing a rocket car towards a wall. So
that is an amazing point. That is exactly, I think, the right thing that we should be reflecting on, because you're exactly right. And this is, in the corporate context that I spend with my clients, in a corporate strategy conversation, the point you're making is true, is most of the problems that we run into on our planet are not technology problems. They're problems of, like you say, adapting. We don't really absorb, we don't metabolize this pace of change very well. And there are so many aspects of our world that are not subject to these kinds of exponential curves that I'm talking about. And like you say, like, we as people are due for kind of like a big, I hate to, again, this is very much an analogy and a metaphor, but like a software upgrade to sort of absorb and be able to sort of meet and orient to absorbing these changes. And then I will come back to, in the final piece, I think sort of grounding this in the context of energy or sort of resource use on our planet. And it's exactly true that the Earth in many ways does not able to sort of absorb these sort of exponential curves that we're sort of describing in certain contexts. But I'll come back and address that. Any other, yeah.
I was wondering, looking at that graph, if there's a potential reset point where things stop and jump back down again. Because a lot of this is dependent upon, like, we had trouble getting the microphone working today. Electricity, electromagnetism, things that maybe we can't also predict. The technology is not really organic.
Yeah. So this is I wasn't really going to spend time mentioning, but I think given what the observation you're making is an insightful one. So I'll mention that what's important to note, and this is getting a little too in the weeds, there's no such thing as an exponential curve that just continues forever. We don't see it in nature. We don't see it. It just doesn't exist. And so if we're being really fair to what we're seeing here, is you could think of it as a collection of what are called S-curves. So at every point, at every paradigm in this chart, essentially the current technology domain, and you can see at the top of this graph, we have different kinds of computers. Today we use integrated circuits. We used to use single transistors, vacuum tube. If you see these massive machines from like the 1950s, what happened is that the limitations, and very often it's a physics limitation, we always reach the limits of whatever technology domain. And what that means is, there are always limits to these exponential curves. You're also really, it's important to call out the observation you're making is that this really does depend on so many different things, right? Like today, most of the integrated circuits that power the world are, manufactured on one tiny island in the, South China Sea that, has massive geopolitical complications surrounding it that you can imagine if something changes, like possibly this doesn't. But the other side of the argument is that this is a 125-year-old chart. And look how consistent it is. You don't see World War I, you don't see World War II. There's something about the sort of like distributed problem solving of many different teams working on trying to sort of meet, this like Wright's law. It seems to be like a really powerful force. But I think what you're bringing in is something that's exactly right. That this shouldn't be taken as some sort of law of nature because it's dependent on so many other sort of geopolitical and market forces.
You have exponential growth of viruses, for example.
But there's always some limitation. There's always there's like a cap on like a virus can if a virus becomes widespread in a population, it can only go as far as the host population is. There's always some cap. There's always some, like a rabbit population is always referenced as an exponential growth. There's always some carrying capacity that once the population gets big enough, it cannot support, and there's always some limit.
Carrying capacity for exponential growth of tech.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. What is the carrying capacity for the exponential growth of tech? It's a really nice way to put it. The one thing I will say that is consistent, though, is that this is a collection of stacked technologies that themselves reach their carrying capacity. And my guess, we're actually already kind of at the physics limitations of integrated circuits. You can only shrink a circuit so small and put transistors close enough together. But there's a whole set of domains of new kinds of computing. We won't go into the details. Neuromorphic computing, quantum computing, there's like light-based, there's like other ways of producing computation that may carry on this, again, price performance. But yeah, that's a great way to frame it. What is the carrying capacity for the exponential growth of technology?
Does the Earth's resources have something to do with it, perhaps?
Absolutely, and depending on what domain you're talking about, well, this afternoon I'm going to talk about material science with how AI is impacting how we design batteries, which AI is having a role. But like today, most of our batteries are lithium. That's like a metal you have to dig out of the ground. That's, there's huge resource constraints. I'll take one more, and then I'll move back into the second part of this.
The editor of Wired magazine said the next step from AI would be the collective mind. You can imagine the exponential growth of millions of minds collectively working together.
I love that. There's an innovation theorist, I forget what university he's at, who makes the argument that the story of innovation across human history can be correlated to how quickly the pace of communication between scientists. Like in the 17th century, for two scientists collaborating, they had to write a piece of paper, put it on a boat, and then someone on a horse delivers it. You're checking your email like once every few months. Whereas what started to happen, why cities and urban environments became huge sort of drivers of innovation, is because you have people with different ideas in a very sort of highly dense environment and able to share ideas more quickly. And cities have become huge innovation engines. And what's happening in the world today, and what you're referring to, is this idea that we are now in this interglobally connected world where a good idea, in some part of the world will, instantly be known about in another part of the world. This is why, Prout, is another system is built on these decentralized local autonomy. A good idea in Portugal will be able to be understood by, someone in Argentina within minutes. And so I think it's a great point you're making, that we'll be able to coordinate at a speed and at a much faster pace than we're used to. Okay. So this is just a brief section. This is just a short piece. I want to kind of move through this now. So given what we're talking about, I want to give a model. This is just a way to organize our thinking about the kinds of phenomenon that we can expect as we see these technologies become subject to exponential growth. And I'll go through these, but it's first important to understand that all of what I'm talking about really depends on this idea that we're digitizing the world. So what does digitizing mean? There's some misconception, I think, about what the word digital actually means, how computers actually function. So when we look at a computer chip like this is, one of the advanced new chips that Apple makes. This has billions and billions of what are called transistors. Transistors are essentially think of them as like little light switches. They can be in one of two states. They can be on or off. It's very reductive, it's very, one or the other. And so that's why all computers speak in this language of what's called binary, where it's essentially everything is just like a 1 or a 0. And so just for reference, like when you open Microsoft Word and you type in the letter A, somewhere, very physically, there's a physical sort of set of transistors that are changing position to, basically account for either on, off, in this configuration of 0, 1. Everything in the world of computing requires today this kind of sort of binary, discrete, one or the other. There's a much longer conversation to be had about the philosophy of, technology and, the world is itself irreducibly complex that doesn't really lend itself to this kind of machine-readable language. But because of this, as we deploy more and more computer chips into the world around us, this is a kind of a cliche quote from more than 10 years ago. This is Mark Andreessen, a figure from very global capitalism, but this quote gets used all the time, where he says, software is eating the world. Right? So what does he mean by this? Here's a good example. So one of the most fascinating industries to watch the progression over the last decade or so is what's happening in the world of automotive. So building a car. And I'll use Tesla just because it's the company I'm most familiar with. The way that Tesla operates as a company, they don't actually see themselves as a car company. They don't really make cars. They make computers. They really operate and see themselves as a consumer electronics company. The reason for this is that a Tesla today and most electric vehicles are far more driven by their software, by their onboard computers. For example, when you press the accelerator on a Tesla, there's almost nothing happening at a mechanical level. There's no gas turbine, there's no engine. You're basically communicating with a computer on the car that is run by hundreds of millions of lines of code. And I know this because I have a friend who spent most of his career as a mechanical engineer at Apple, worked with software, building consumer electronics, making computers. About 5 years ago, he got a job at Tesla. And when I asked him, I was like, hey, how is life at Tesla? I was really surprised by his answer. He said, it's actually very similar to working at Apple. The way they design their teams, the way they deploy code, it really feels more like working at a consumer electronics company. They really make computers. Now, this is completely transforming the automotive industry. It changes how we think about what a car even is. This is a company called Rivian. They make an electric truck. And what this is saying is that now their software updates, they can do really interesting things. Like in this case, they improved the battery range of the car. So that means that the car on a single charge is now capable of driving further than it was before. Think of it like if you have a gas car at home, imagine going to sleep at night and waking up in the morning and your car now has a 20% better fuel economy, right? These are really more like iPhones. This is really more like an iPhone than it is a car. It's basically run on these software updates. Now I use the automotive industry as an example, but this is coming to our clothes, to our buildings, to our appliances. This is, people may not have known this, but the last World Cup, all of the balls played with in the World Cup had to be charged before every game because they have these little computer chips in them and they're tracking, the activity on the field, they're getting software updates. This is what's coming to the world around us. Okay, so that's this concept of digitizing the world. The next two we've really already touched on, so I won't spend a lot of time. But I want to make the point that it's very hard to understand these exponential curves, especially at the beginning. So remember when I said, with the penny example, your manager comes in and it's halfway through the month, they see a pile of money and they're expecting $500,000. when they don't see a $500,000, it's very easy to get disappointed. And this is very common. There's so many sort of corporate strategy examples where a company that misunderstands this, they write off a technology before it's ready to hit the curve. But really what we see is that eventually what can happen is become disruptive. It feels like chaotic, it's amazing, everything just feels like it happened overnight. ChatGPT just showed up and people forget that there was like a decade of there was GPT-1, GPT-2, like these came out in 10 years before ChatGPT came out. Now, I'm giving a presentation about technology, but I want to pause and just make one point that I was thinking about yesterday, informed by some of the discussions from the week. I can imagine in a room of people like you who are doing incredible work, service, working in schools, working to raise the consciousness of life on this planet. I imagine it can very often feel like nothing is happening. It can feel very discouraging, that like change isn't happening. My sense is that in conversations about how change on planet Earth will arrive and what it will feel like, it will probably feel something like this. It will feel like you've been working for decades and decades and decades, but then all of a sudden, something happened and now, things are moving at a pace that you couldn't even believe before. I think, and I hope that this is something that can breed, optimism, that, the work that you're doing in your lives are actually very likely to have a huge impact in the future. Now, just to go back to the technology piece, maybe, again, the best example of this kind of like chaotic, amazing moment we're seeing is what's happening in the deployment of solar. It is just unbelievably staggering, the speed, the pace at which solar technology is being deployed. Again, it is doubling in its installation base probably once every 33 months or so. We are just, like all of the operating logic that informs how governments are planning for the future is just being completely unreal. I had a fascinating conversation with Sohail, who you're going to be hearing from after, about some of the work that he's done in this space with some of his clients, that just, these energy equations of our forecasting models. And I came across, this was just announced 5 days ago. I saw this yesterday, but for the first time ever, last month, June, in the EU, the single biggest source of power for the entire EU was from solar. That's never happened before. This is 5 days ago. This is just the beginning. This is just the beginning of what's coming. Dematerialization. This is a fairly straightforward concept, but this is basically the idea that when something becomes subject to software, very often the physical medium goes away, right? Like how many of you still have physical GPS devices that you have to take out of your glove box, put on the car, right? We probably should all have flashlights, physical flashlights, but for most of us, a flashlight is just lines of code, right? It's a piece of software on our phones. That doesn't mean we lose, the physical hardware. It just means that software becomes the defining mechanism that we use to orient our way of navigating the world. And so we're dematerializing, we're kind of vaporizing the world into code. And the final one, and this is really, as I transition now into Neohumanism, this is the piece that is probably the thing that gets me most excited, and the single most important thing I want to leave with you, is what this means ultimately. And you can see the 6 Ds. We had to find 6 words that start with D, but demonetize and democratize. What does that mean? Demonetize means things that were once very expensive. Only wealthy companies, only governments and nation states had access, becomes far cheaper. And when a technology becomes cheaper, many more people can now use that technology. Now here's why that gets me excited. And I'll use this example. So this is a photograph of a software developer who grew up in rural Japan on a cucumber farm. His name is Makoto Koike. He's standing behind his parents in that photograph. One of the challenges of running and operating a cucumber farm in rural Japan is that you have to organize your cucumbers based on the quality into their different price categories. You basically assign a different price based on the quality of the cucumber. And in Japan, it's the standards, they have 9 different price categories. Now what this means is that Makoto's mother, during peak harvest season, would typically spend 8 or 9 hours every single day just sorting cucumbers into the different price categories. And so what Makoto did is he built his mother a cucumber sorting robot. The reason I love this example is every technology that you see that's required to build this machine 10, 15, 20 years ago would have been unbelievably expensive. The cameras that are taking the pictures would have cost thousands of dollars. He's using a computer vision machine learning AI, which 10, 15 years ago would have required a room of servers to process all the data. He's running this on just a consumer, computer, normal desktop. The point is, the key reason I show this, the only companies on the planet who could have built this machine 15 years ago would have been a Google, a Microsoft. It would have required like the United States government to build this machine. That today, because these technologies are getting cheaper, is now available to a rural cucumber farm in Japan. Now the reason this gets me excited is you can imagine all of the problems in the world very often are embedded within a very local context. Within a context, like a Google doesn't care about the problems that arise on a cucumber farm in Japan. But again, and I know I keep referring to Prout as a system, but Prout is very much built on local autonomy, decentralized problem solving, and very soon individuals embedded within their local communities will have access to the tools to be able to solve the problems. And so this democratization effect is a really critical sort of reason why we should care about these exponential growth curves. Okay, now I want to close on just a few minutes. I have 3 closing points that I want to make where I want to ground what I've talked about within the context of the social philosophy of Neohumanism. And I have 3 very specific points. So the first point is this question of who is capable of participating in the world of innovation today. And very often when I work at Singularity, I have these executives that come to our classroom, and very often they'll hear a presentation and they'll think to themselves, well, I didn't go to Harvard, I didn't go to MIT, I don't have a mechanical engineering background, I don't know how to program software. So innovation, technology, this must be for someone else, right? There's someone else who can do this. That may have been true 15, 20 years ago. Today, what's really exciting is it's not only access to the technologies that's getting democratized, it's also access to the skills, the knowledge. We live in the age of the internet, YouTube videos, talk to ChatGPT, whatever. And I want to give just a few examples of some projects that have come out of Singularity University that kind of demonstrate this point. So this is a photo of Butch Wilmore. He's a NASA astronaut. This is a photograph from the International Space Station. And in his hand, he is holding a wrench. And what's interesting and important to know about that wrench, that is the first object that was ever manufactured off of planet Earth. That wrench was built in space. And the reason he was able to manufacture that in space is on the International Space Station, they have a 3D printer. The reason they have a 3D printer is one of my friends from Singularity, his name's Aaron Kemmer, came to a program at Singularity. He learned about what was happening in digital manufacturing, and he said, well, what if I could build one of these tools that actually works in zero gravity? And he did it. He built a 3D printer. It is now functioning on the International Space Station. The point I want to make, Aaron's background before he came to Singularity, he had no background in technology. He had no background in mechanical engineering, aerospace. He worked in advertising. He was essentially like a PR. He was writing press releases before he came to Singularity University, and he built this company. This is the next one. So this is Paula. This is my friend Paula from Singularity. She came in about 10 years ago and was really fascinated by the improvement in drone technology, and in particular the ability for drones to carry heavy objects. And so she wanted to look at one of the challenges in the world where there are very poor road infrastructure. So in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, during the wet season, roads will wash away. It's very difficult to get vaccines or move blood around. And so she wanted to build a company that could look at using these drones to sort of move goods, specifically in the world of healthcare, around. And she built a company, it's called Matternet, that was the world's first drone delivery. This is a concept that has actually become quite popular. There are now many drone delivery companies. They're all sort of informed by Paula's company called Matternet. Now she actually had a project with UNICEF where they were delivering, doing HIV testing, much quicker because they could move drones. The point I want to make, Paula's background before she came to Singularity, she was a lawyer. She went to law school. Like, she had no background in technology, no background in drones. And then this example, I'm really excited just in the context of a room of educators. This is Lala. She came to a program. She's from Myanmar. She was a K through 12 teacher, in Myanmar, this war-torn country. Very, very difficult journey that she's had. She now lives in the United States. One of the challenges that she was struggling with in Myanmar is that, and I imagine this is something you might run into, it's very expensive to update curriculum and update textbooks because of the printing costs of printing new textbooks. And so in Myanmar, they were using textbooks that were decades old in some sense. One of the technologies she learned about was the development of augmented reality, using these essentially what are like game engines, like video game tools to create these very intuitive lessons using spatial computing. And again, she was a K through 12 teacher. She learned just enough of Unity, which is one of these game engines, to build this, to be capable, and then built a team to build this company. She now has a company called 360 Ed, which is using augmented reality to solve this particular problem in Myanmar. So that's the first point, this idea that anyone today is capable. If you have kids that you teach, don't write them off as being incapable of working with technology. Anyone can do it. That leads me to my second point. My second point is really, I cannot stress enough the urgency within which that the tools that we're developing are so powerful that they're really democratizing the ability to do things that were unthinkable even 15, 20 years ago. I'm using very positive examples, but I don't think it's challenging for us to imagine the horrors and the problems that we can also have on the world using these same technologies. It's a very cliche quote. I love Spider-Man, any opportunity to throw it in, but this idea, with great power comes great responsibility. And this is why most of the problems we face are not technology problems. They're what we as people choose to do with these technologies. And then coupled with this, the final point, what I want to end, the final point I want to make, is I would really caution us away from falling into the trap of buying into any narrative that is extremely polarizing in one direction or the other, right? It's very common to hear that technologies are destroying the planet. And this is true. I don't mean to undermine. There are a lot of problems and horrors coming from these technologies, right? But I also very often will hear, especially in Silicon Valley, that technology is going to save us all. We're going to have this utopia. It's going to solve all of our problems. And that's also just as dangerous. I think what I really want to stress is that there's probably some kind of middle ground, right? Now, this is true. These AI models we're building are incredibly energy intensive. We're going to talk this afternoon about how these systems work and why they're so energy intensive. And we're surrounded with these narratives. What we don't hear about as often is a company like UPS. So they started using these kinds of machine learning systems to take in data about traffic conditions, weather patterns, what they can measure about the vehicle. That now they use AI to optimize the delivery route, where an AI will basically define the route it takes. For the last year and a half, UPS trucks, each driver, this is every driver, is now driving an average of 16 to 20 kilometers less per day and achieving the same delivery output. That is hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon removed from the atmosphere. This is essentially the same example, just with an even bigger, more important global industry, which is shipping. Maersk is essentially using the same kind of systems to optimize route, traffic patterns. Ports are using AI to limit the amount of times that a ship has to idle waiting to get into the port. We're just, there are some reports that by 10 years from now, we will remove, using these same tools, something on the order of 8 exajoules of energy demand. That's like pulling the entire country of Mexico off the energy grid from energy demand, right? So again, I don't want to undermine these tremendous global challenges that we're facing. We have huge, enormous issues that we need to sort of address. One example I think that maybe can sort of provide a metaphor for how to think about this. In the late 1800s, there was actually a fairly urgent kind of environmental crisis that if you go back and read the news at the time, it actually appears very similar to the way that we talk about climate change today. Of course, it was limited to specific cities. In New York City in the late 1800s, there were around 150,000 horses living in the city, right? They were producing about 20 pounds of manure every single day. That's 140,000 tons of manure every single month. And if you go back and you read some of these, these news articles, my understanding is that the Times of London called out that in the middle of the 20th century, we could expect, piles of manure, feet deep in our cities. This was a huge crisis. It was like an unthinkable crisis. Now, how did this get resolved? It got resolved because a technology that people couldn't have even imagined, that wasn't on their radar, was developed that completely transformed the transportation infrastructure, that created an entirely different world that was almost unthinkable. It just, no one could have imagined what a world of combustion engine vehicles and cars looked like. Now again, the point I'm making, I'm not a techno-solutionist. I'm not saying that technologies are going to solve our problems. But I think we need to keep in mind that the world is going to change, and there are things that will happen that will completely transform the operating logic that we make sense of. And so to think about some of the technologies that are coming, right? We have a lot of whole-timer yogic monks in the room. Many of you might be working on what are called master units, these eco-villages where these kinds of systems will be able to help us in agricultural settings. It won't be such tedious human labor as much in the future. We haven't really talked about the life sciences, right? This digital biology. This is one of the most staggering fields that is transforming the world. This is an image of an MIT professor who created this biopolymer. It's a bacterially produced biopolymer, so it's essentially a textile made entirely out of this bacterial production that completely transforming how people are thinking, how we can manufacture clothes and apparel. This is a shoe that when you're done using it, you could go and dig under a tree, place the shoe, and it will completely break down in nature. It's entirely natural. This is another project of another university where, using cellular agriculture to basically grow, instead of creating spandex from petrochemicals, you could actually create a biodegradable alternative. You'd be like growing yoga pants on trees, right? Like that's essentially what we're talking about. This afternoon, I'm going to talk more about the kind of generative AI systems, and of course, ChatGPT we're familiar with, but in medicine, this is completely transforming. This is what's called Zero Shot. This is a company that is, and I'm not overstating this, there's certain parts of the drug discovery process that typically take decades, like millions, screening through millions of different protein compounds to find the right structure, that this company is now able to do in hours. Right? Like that's the speed at which we're going to create new protein structures. And then the last example, just to go back to the energy, this is a company called Terraform. Their idea, it's not a new technology, they've figured out how to do it much cheaper, where basically what they do is they take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they use electricity produced from solar power, and they use that carbon dioxide to create a synthetic natural gas. So it's basically a fuel source that our existing infrastructure knows how to use. It's gas, but it does it by removing carbon dioxide. It's not carbon neutral, it's carbon negative. And so this company has they have a white paper where they basically argue that if we can actually increase our solar capacity by 1,000x, which sounds crazy, but again, doubling every 33 months, their projections is that sometime in the next 15 or 20 years, we may be able to meet today's current energy requirements using this process. Now, I don't know if this is going to work, right? Like, there's a ton of reasons why that's a bad idea or is not going to work, but this is just one of many, many experiments in energy and new kinds of energy systems that, again, we tend to dismiss, that it feels like nothing is happening, but if one of these systems come online, it transforms everything about the world. So there's a lot of problems that we need to address. And I'm going to end on this just very brief anecdote, just a quick story. So this is a true story. This was from March of this year. So this was a few months ago, like 4 or 5 months ago. There was a little girl in eastern Ghana in a small farming village. It's called Gabinetri. And she was playing next to her father, was working in the field, and there was like a pile of firewood, and she was playing next to the firewood. And unfortunately, there was a snake. There was a venomous snake in the firewood, and it came and it bit her in the leg. And immediately her parents knew the urgency, the problem that this raised. So they rushed her to the local health clinic, the closest one, and the doctors were really quite upset and quite shocked. This is the snake bite. They understood typically in adults can create heart paralysis in about 45 minutes. They do have an anti-venom for this, but this health center had run out. They didn't have the anti-venom. So So what they needed to do, there's a company called Zipline, which is, again, one of these drone delivery companies that keep these distribution centers now around different parts of Ghana. This is where they've launched this. And they were able to get an anti-venom in the air, traveling at 100 kilometers per hour, and they got the anti-venom to this health clinic in under half an hour. And the good news, the little girl responded well to the anti-venom and was saved as a result of this. Now, I tell this story knowing full well that about 1,500 kilometers, we're not that far, we could be there in less than a day. These same technologies are being used in one of the most deadly and horrific battlefield environments that we have seen on this planet, right? The nature of warfare has changed where like 3 out of every 4 casualties happening on the Russia-Ukraine battlefront is now coming from this exact same technology. People aren't dying by gunshots anymore. People are dying because we put bombs on drones and fly them around a battlefield. So the same technology that is causing this like horrific environment, very close to where we're sitting right now, is somehow the same technology that there's a little girl in Ghana who is still alive today, 5 months later after this. So the question is not about the technology. The question really is about what we as people choose to do with the technology. Thank you.